I invite you to bow your heads with me for prayer. Gracious God, we are here today on a beautiful day to consider questions about your universe and about the mysteries that you've laid out before us. Thank you for giving us the organ of curiosity within our bodies. Help us to continue to use that to explore what you've given us. Continue to challenge us with new ideas and new thoughts, and grant us compassion when we interact with those around us. Continue to be with us today. We love you, Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Neil. Terry Dopp was born in Washington State, and as a preacher's kid had the privilege of growing up all over the country, including Alaska, California, Massachusetts, and Virginia. And this also included many fun summers at Wawona in Yosemite. Incidentally, do we know whether the camp had any damage in the recent fires in the park? Does anyone know about that? I don't remember hearing anything about it. Anyway, Terry's formal education was completed on the other coast, the right coast. Her BA is from Columbia Union College, where she graduated summa cum laude with a double major in history and English. She earned her master's degree in English from the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Isn't that in historic Williamsburg? I think so. Before settling in the Pacific Northwest, Terry served as an editorial assistant at Guide magazine and as a publications officer at Loma Linda University Medical Center. She has been teaching at Walla Walla University ever since joining the faculty there in 1979, and where she is currently professor of both history and English. Somehow, during her time at Walla Walla, Terry managed to bear and raise two now college-age children while also earning a PhD in American and New England Studies from Boston University in 1986. With her interest in American religious history, it was not surprising that Dr. Aamodt helped form the planning group for, and then served as the co-director of, the 2009 National Academic Conference on Ellen White in Ellen's hometown of Portland, Maine. That conference led to the publication of Ellen Harmon White, American Prophet, the book that was published by Oxford University Press just in April of this year, and the book we've been encouraging you to acquire and read. It is a collective biography of 18 chapters written by 21 authors, quite a number of whom have served as speakers here at the San Diego Forum over the years. I'm sure we can't even imagine the amount of energy and work that it took to edit that many manuscripts into the cohesive volume that it is. You are to be commended, Terry, for that work. You must have been exhausted. Are you recovered yet? Hard to tell. Well, apparently you have recovered, as you're already writing your next book, Ellen White, Voice and Vision, a volume in the Adventist Pioneers biography series edited by George Knight. Dr. Aamodt has many other publications to her credit. She has participated in National Endowment for the Humanities seminars across the country and has made numerous presentations on a variety of topics, including professional baseball, of which I understand you're an avid fan. She is also the recipient of multiple awards, including several at Walla Walla for excellence in both teaching and scholarship. Terry lives with her husband, Larry, a member of the Walla Walla University Electrical Engineering faculty, and together with their kids, they enjoy many outdoor activities, including skiing, backpacking, running, and cycling. Terry, thank you very much for spending such a long day flying yesterday to be with us here today and educate us on Ellen White and the public. Please welcome Dr. Aamodt.
Thank you so much, and I want to really thank the San Diego Adventist Forum, which over the years I think has been a bulwark of thoughtful conversation and discussion, and the work of Jim Katz and Gordon Rick and others has just been absolutely outstanding, and especially for making the proceedings of the discussions here available to others and kind of archiving all of that information that you've generated over the years. That's really been an enormous contribution to healthy discussion in Adventism. I will also mention, because some have asked, that W.E. Dopp, who was the youth director in the Southeastern California Conference from 1965 to 1970, was my uncle. And I'm so glad that people still remember my Uncle Bill. Ellen White devoted her 70-year public career to developing a community of believers. She and her husband James and their somewhat older friend Joseph Bates appealed to the Holy Spirit to help them forge a functional church from a small band of fractious, disappointed Millerites. Her visions helped the early community form a consensus around central teachings about the Sabbath, the sanctuary, the final judgment, the close of probation, the second advent. Her testimony letters sought to turn gossiping, backbiting congregations into communities of faith. Her articles and books exhorted Adventists toward more exalted levels of diet, dress, faith, temperance, racial tolerance. She pushed every technological and media button available in the 19th century, inspiring her denomination to form a vast publishing enterprise, the largest Protestant education system in the world, a global mission network, an intricately designed and tightly knit church administration, a healthcare conglomerate, and a worldwide body that today numbers 18 million members. It's hard to imagine where Seventh-day Adventists would be without Ellen White. A body of faith forms from the conviction that it constitutes a partnership between the human and the divine, with each side of the equation being essential. When she felt a call to become part of that equation, Ellen Harmon felt weak and infirm and unequal to the task. Toward the end of her long life, though, she acknowledged that in some ways her infirmities had been the source of her spiritual strength and her spiritual focus. When we study her today, we think a great deal about what she did within the circle of Adventism, where her influence, I think, is incalculable. We spent less time thinking about how she related to the general public. However, talking to the public was an important part of her life work. Although nearly forgotten today, Ellen White's connection with public audiences provided a reality check as she navigated the turbulent early life of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As a group of Adventist academics sought in 2007 to reintroduce her to a segment of the public, historical scholars, we examined again the public dimension of her career during her lifetime. Ellen White felt that her church's focus should be directed outward as well as inward. She knew how to adapt her message to her audience's needs and understanding, and the public validation of her insights lent authority to her counsels to fellow believers. Ellen Harmon's first message to a larger audience was a personal and a spiritual one. It was 1842, nearly time for the world to end, and more people in Portland, Maine seemed to know it. Ellen Harmon believed it more fervently than most and wrestled with her unworthiness to meet Jesus face to face. Several times already she had felt the assurance of salvation, but there was still room for doubt. Just 14 and still self-conscious from a facial injury, she was ready for a private relationship, just her and God. But she felt a tug to show her commitment in public, not just by attending services, but by participating with her voice. She was terrified. What if she began the sacred act of praying out loud and then lost her train of thought? Panic could lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy of stammering, or worse yet, silence and embarrassment to the cause of God. Every time she prayed alone, in silence, something inside impressed her that a commitment on that level was not enough. She stopped praying altogether and found herself, she said, in a melancholy state and finally in deep despair. After suffering privately for months, after all, she's an adolescent, how could she tell someone else? No one would possibly understand her dilemma. Her mother, who was wiser than maybe Ellen would acknowledge then but would later, invited her to join a group worshiping at her uncle's home. I consented to go with my mother, she recalled later, to please her. As the group knelt to pray, one of her earlier pleas was answered. Her crippling anxiety disappeared. My mouth was open. No sooner did I begin to speak than the power of God gave voice that reached a mile. Shouting Methodist was nothing to be trifled with. Reached a mile, and there I dedicated myself to God, she remembered. This meeting had not been her uncle's idea. He had lost his faith. I cannot live in this house. I must get out of it, he said in panic when he heard his niece's shouts of spiritual ecstasy. I know what that is. I have had it. I have passed through that experience of loving and serving God, but I am a backslider. Do get her out of the house. His niece did not go home that night. These things happened in Methodist circles. Occasionally, when people were overcome by the Spirit in an evening meeting, they did not have the strength to go home until the next day. We cannot get her out of the house, her prayer partners told her uncle. She's helpless. Helpless, perhaps, but far from silent. From that day the cloud burst, she said. When this victory came to me, I've held it with a grip that would never let it go. I went from house to house, and I did not go to greet the people. I went right to my companions, and I talked with them all night long. And I would pray with them until they gave their hearts to God, and thus I went from street to street and house to house and worked in my childhood, and I've worked ever since. The latter part of this description comes from a sermon that Ellen White preached in 1909, 67 years later. Her breakthrough about praying and witnessing in public was a crucial foundational moment for her 70-year public career, which began in earnest in late 1844, 2 years after this event. Now, although most of her encounters with the public were positive, the early years of her career presented challenges. Other people, including several other young women, were also having visionary experiences. Ann Taves has noted that M.F. Whittier, the brother of John Greenleaf Whittier, wrote that among Portland's children of light, nothing was more common than visions. Frederick Hoyt documented at least 5 radical Adventist visionaries. I know many of you have heard him present on that topic, as well as others. And in addition to Ellen Harmon, others who were active at the time were William Foy, Emily Clemens, Dorinda Baker, Phoebe Knapp, and Mary Hamlin. According to Ann Taves, news sources documenting the events of this period have proved disconcerting for many Seventh-day Adventists, but they do not so much undercut a careful reading of White's most detailed accounts of this period as heighten our understanding of the crisis of authority radical Adventists faced at this time. While doing newspaper research on Adventist history in Maine in the 1970s, Frederick Hoyt discovered accounts of the 1845 trial of a radical Adventist from Atkinson, Maine, named Israel Damon. Ellen White discussed this incident in her 1860 edition of Experience and Views, indicating she was present at the meeting and speaking when Elder Damon was arrested for disturbing the peace. Not only was her description of Elder Damon sympathetic, but the story she told about his arrest was cast in the idiom of the shout tradition. Although she was not charged and did not testify at the trial, her name came up and her role was discussed several times. The newspaper trial report refers to two vision women, sisters Dorinda Baker of Orrington and Ellen Harmon of Portland. According to the testimony at the trial, the witnesses all agreed that the two women spent much of the meeting lying on their backs on the floor in a trance. Many who were present testified both visionaries were genuine. It was only later that Ellen White would emerge as a singular force, and when she faced the public in later years, the settings were conventional. After spending a good deal of time in the 1860s and 1870s writing and visiting camp meetings with her husband James, Ellen branched out more and more into a solo speaking career, primarily because James, after his series of strokes, was sometimes too ill to go out and speak and travel. During her middle-aged years, she made room in her schedule for public lectures and sermons, and these became a regular staple of her time on the road. Ellen White owed her most memorable season of public speaking in the summers of 1875 and 1876 in part to her niece, Mary Clow. Mary sympathized with her aunt's religion but never entered the Adventist fold. Her ability to communicate with the general public, however, was unmatched during Ellen White's career. A skilled writer and editor and journalist, Mary Clow expended some serious shoe leather on advance work, carrying news releases she had to write out by hand to local papers days ahead of Ellen White's arrival. And this happened throughout the Midwest and Northeast in hundreds of cities. Mary Clow's advance work bore fruit across the United States in 1875 and 1876. As curiosity seekers were drawn in larger numbers to Adventist campgrounds, she advertised more sermons and lectures by her aunt on health and temperance. This activity peaked in 1876 during the camp meeting in Groveland, Massachusetts. And swelling the audience of 500 campers, crowds of non-Adventists flocked to the site on special trains dedicated to the event, undoubtedly encouraged by Mary Clow's glowing press reports. By Sunday, August 27, Clow later reported trains from nearby towns filled with intelligent, in other words, well-educated people, arrived for the morning meeting and heard James White preach. As the trains continued to roll in, Ellen White prepared to take her turn at the podium to deliver a sermon on temperance. White later noted that 20,000 were estimated to be on the grounds that day and called it the most solemn sight I ever beheld. From her ecstatic shouts in 1842 at age 14 to her final nationwide speaking tour in 1909 at age 81, Ellen White's career included a significant public dimension. As Ellen White endured her final injury and illness in 1915, her assistants contacted newspapers all across the country, this time to prepare for an imminent announcement of her death. When the end came on July 16, Clarence Chrysler's obituary mentioned that in her role as an evangelist, she often preached to thousands, her voice having resonance and carrying power, and he emphasized her public speaking on temperance and health. In August 1915, The Independent noted that the United States had recently lost two prophetesses, Mary Baker Eddy in 1910 and Ellen G. Harmon White. Many of Mrs. Eddy's disciples believed she would never die, noted the author, and Mrs. White hoped to be one of those who would be taken up alive to meet the Lord in the air. But the Lord delayed his coming, and she entered into rest, just as others do, in her 88th year, according to the article. The article compared both women to the first American prophetess, Anne Hutchinson. Although Ellen White declined to claim the title of prophet, she would have agreed that she filled the prophetic function of exhorting the faithful, calling the unfaithful to repentance, and appealing to the undecided. Now, a significant slice of the public remembered Ellen White in 1915. Let's fast forward to 2009. The Seventh-day Adventist Church had grown impressively during the interval of nearly a century, and Ellen White's books and organizational strategies could be seen all over the world. Her spiritual classic, Steps to Christ, had become available in more than 165 languages, and no one even knows now how many of her copies of Steps to Christ have been distributed. One estimate is 100 million, which is probably in the ballpark. She has been well known among Adventists worldwide, of course. Outside the denomination, though, she's all but disappeared. Adventists had little, if any, presence in religious history books. And it's interesting to see, and I've watched this for now since the 1980s, see American history college textbooks handle the story of innovative religious groups in the 19th century. American historians love the Mormon story. Its innovations and its westward migration connect with a larger American historical narrative, and sex and violence abound. Survey textbook writers lavish attention on Mormons. They feel obligated to mention the Millerites, but until recently, those notations have been brief and inaccurate, picking up on myths that were disproved in the 1950s by the few historians who were paying attention then. The appearance of the book The Disappointed in 1987, edited by Ronald Numbers and Jonathan Butler, affected general textbook descriptions of the Millerites. Textbook authors actually pay attention to scholarship, which became more accurate and nuanced. The survey textbooks have yet to discover Ellen White and the Adventists, despite their own robust connection to a larger American historical narrative or counter-narrative, as noted by Bull and Lockhart in 1989 and by Douglas Morgan in 2001. Because Adventists have grown into a world church of significant size, now outnumbering Mormons and Jews. The prominence of their female co-founder, who outlived Joseph Bates and James White by decades. By 2009, their past was a historical story waiting to happen. And to tell the next part of the story, I have to describe to you how I became involved with Ellen White in my profession of teaching and studying American history. I guess it was maybe some kicking and screaming involved. As a college student and then a young professional in the 1970s, I kept at arm's length the discussions of Ellen White that were roiling Adventism. These contentious discussions are well known. Not as well known as the extent of anguish and personal pain that affected most of the people involved. I picked up just enough about that at the time to know that studying Ellen White professionally was not for me. When I entered the historical profession in the mid-1980s, my older and wiser colleagues made it clear that enmeshing oneself in Adventist history in general, and Ellen White history in particular, was a recipe for professional suicide. That was a good reason to keep my distance, and I was plenty busy anyway investigating other aspects of American religion and culture, especially around the time of the Civil War. I started to change my mind in 1996. I attended a conference in Hartford, Connecticut that focused on American women writers. The occasion was the centennial of the death of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a person of interest in my own work. And we heard a great deal about various female authors, including some who had recently been rediscovered, such as Harriet Jacobs and Frances Harper. I remember thinking to myself, I bet not one of these people has heard of Ellen White. She was a significant woman author, and if left to themselves, it was unlikely they would ever find out about her. About that time, Adventist historians who had been meeting in the 1970s and 80s during those troubled times and then had let their meetings lapse, began meeting again. And the Association of Seventh-day Adventist Historians, also known as ASDA, met at the Walla Walla College Portland campus in 1998. I remember saying in casual conversation that it was time for Adventist scholars to introduce Ellen White to the general academic community. We all nodded in agreement and did nothing. In 2001, we met at Andrews, along with a guest speaker, Ronald Numbers, and I asked him at that time if he would be willing to chair a national conference in Portland, Maine. He said, sure. I did nothing. In 2004, we met at Pacific Union College along with the invited guest, Jonathan Butler. I asked him if he would be interested in participating in a national conference on Ellen White, and he said, sure. And I did nothing. Actually, I was doing many things. It just was not this particular thing. Then in 2007, we met at Oakwood. And while we were touring their extensive campus, which requires a bus, it used to be a plantation, there's 1,200 acres, our bus broke down on the far corner. And I sat in the back row with Julius Naum, Michael Campbell, and Douglas Morgan. We brainstormed about how this much discussed but still imaginary Ellen White conference would actually look like. Took a long time to get the bus going, so we actually got to the concrete stage of planning a conference and the eventual book that would emerge from the conference, a book that would introduce historical scholars to Ellen White. I cannot overemphasize how much Julius Naum had to do with providing the spark to actually ignite this process after we talked about it for so many years. Within a few weeks, we had enlisted Gary Land from Andrews and Ronald Numbers from the University of Wisconsin. The conference began taking shape. We wanted to introduce the general academic community, especially religious historians, to Ellen White. They knew little, if anything, about her. And let me tell you that religious historians tend to come out of history departments in the larger undergraduate and graduate liberal arts part of a university. Church historians tend to be associated with seminaries, and those are actually fields that are quite closely related, and yet sometimes the fields don't talk to each other terribly well. The religious historians in general knew little, if anything, about Ellen White. If they knew about her directly, it was from reading Numbers 1976 study, Prophetess of Health, portions of Bull and Lockhart's Seeking a Sanctuary, and maybe encyclopedia entries on the shut door. If a historian knows anything about early Adventism, it's something about the shut door. They just really think that's interesting, and it's kind of it's an important but not a huge piece in the overall picture. So we agreed that we would bring together chapter authors who had already done work on Ellen White. Most of them were Adventists who participated in ASDA discussions. Some were former Adventists, and we identified two non-SDA scholars who had done significant research on Ellen White, Ann Taves and Laura Vance. The Adventists and former Adventist scholars tended to be somewhat older or younger than I, as my generation almost entirely avoided poking into Adventist history because it was such a minefield when we were in graduate school. Because our conference would enlist respondents to these chapters who knew little or perhaps nothing about Ellen White, we resolved to encourage them to fully participate in this sort of unknown topic by offering to cover all transportation, housing, and meals. We knew that would cost about $100,000, a reality which we found terrifying with justice. But we believed that introducing such a significant figure to the general academic world was a landmark moment. We decided to apply to the National Endowment for the Humanities for half our funding. In our grant narrative, we had to introduce Ellen White to the scholars who would be serving as referees for our proposal. We also needed to show that our project was credible enough, and our profit was credible enough to invite the interest of a major academic publisher. Have any of you ever done colportering? That's something, bless your hearts, I've studiously avoided. I'm so introverted, it was just hideously uncomfortable to think about. But preparing the grant and finding a publisher was a bit like colportering. By the time our proposal went to the National Endowment for the Humanities in December 2008, we had a letter of intent from Oxford University Press. That means the press thinks the project sounds worthwhile, but they expect to see and approve a finished manuscript before they commit to actually publishing it. That's an occasion for more colportering. So how should we talk about Ellen White to an audience that's largely unaware of her? I'll share with you a few paragraphs of our narrative, and I want you to consider how this might sound to you if you were hearing about Ellen White for the first time. Here we go. She was one of the first American women to speak in public. Crowds of 20,000 and more flocked to hear her outdoor temperance lectures. She is one of the most prolific woman authors in history. Her 40-plus books translated into more than 100 languages have sold millions of copies. Equipped with only a few years of elementary education, she helped found 5 colleges and universities and aided in the survival of several others. Her writings produced the largest Protestant parochial school system in the world. Her interest in health spawned the breakfast food industry and inspired the creation of thousands of clinics and hospitals. When she died in 1915, the New York Times and other newspapers across the country reported the event and discussed her achievements. Yet today, Ellen Gould Harmon White is a little-known footnote in American religious history. A follower of William Miller and an eventual co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, she was enshrined by her denomination as a visionary prophet and forgotten by nearly everyone else. Peter W. Williams expressed the opinion of a number of American religious historians when, in the 1999 volume Perspectives on American Religion and Culture, he ranked her with Ann Hutchinson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Mary Baker Eddy, and Amy Semple McPherson, founder of the Foursquare Gospel Church, as one of the most prominent women in American religious history. However, the full range of her life and work and her relationship to American religious history and women's history remain unexplored. This is a thing we kept hammering at because that's what funders and scholars loved, is to find a whole new topic, and a big topic at that. Ellen Harmon and her family were caught up in the Millerite excitement, I'm still reading from the narrative, that swept through New England in the early 1840s. William Miller, a self-taught Bible student and lay preacher, declared that a time-related prophecy in Daniel 8 describing cleansing of the sanctuary actually referred to a specific time when the second coming of Christ would occur. When the predicted date came and went in 1844, many of Miller's adherents fell away disillusioned. Others sought to redefine the events of their great disappointment and forge new movements. Miller's most direct spiritual heirs formed the Advent Christian faith. Ellen Harmon and a handful of others, Joseph Bates, James White, whom she later married, and Uriah Smith, emphasized observance of the seventh-day Sabbath and belief in an imminent, though undated, second coming. In 1863, they formed the Seventh-day Adventist denomination. Ellen Harmon, a physically frail, spiritually sensitive girl who turned 17 just after the Great Disappointment, began to experience visions and dreams that led her to function as, in her words, a messenger of the Lord. Believing her messages were inspired by God, her co-religionists regarded her as a prophet. Her public visions led to publication, sermons, and administrative advice that eventually made her the primary architect of her denomination. Although she never held a formal church office, Ellen White played a uniquely influential role. Her husband James, a powerful Advent preacher and prolific writer, editor, and publisher, shared the pulpit, or desk, as they called it, with his wife at hundreds of camp meetings across the United States. He aided in preparing her vision-inspired testimonies for publication, and the couple inhabited the pages of Adventist periodicals for decades. After James White's death in 1881, her writing and speaking career continued to expand. During her lifetime, she and her co-founders created a tightly organized international denomination with 130,000 members, 56% of them in the United States. The difference between that group and the denomination today, including its size, 15 million, which was the size at the time this was written in 2008, major institutions, worldwide scope, Adventists function in 203 of 237 countries, and distinctive beliefs is largely the result of Ellen White's influence. The White family founded all three North American Adventist publishing houses and marketed their books door to door throughout the United States and later around the world. Ellen White developed an interest in health and medicine and encouraged the establishment of hospitals. She identified the location of several and secured the property for some with down payments from her own pocket. Perhaps a childhood accident that forced her to drop out of school encouraged her lifelong interest in education. She established even more colleges than hospitals, and she donated the proceeds from some of her books to support Adventist education. She spent nearly 2 years in Europe and lived in Australia for 9 more, returning home with ideas for increasing the global growth of the church. Her suggestions for church organization were adopted, and near the end of her life, she saw one of her protégés installed as the longest-serving president of the denomination. As her own religious faith developed from an early emphasis on God's law, a preoccupation for Sabbatarian Adventists who insisted on worshiping on Saturday instead of Sunday, to salvation by faith in God, she brought most of the denomination along with her. Her role within the church as an influential female leader makes her a person of interest in the study of American religion. There's more to the story, however. For example, she is a significant figure in comparative religion, but her role has not been fully examined. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of the 4 most innovative denominations founded in the United States in the 19th century, along with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Church of Christ Scientists, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. The LDS denomination and its leaders undergo thorough historical treatment, and Christian Science has been extensively examined as well. Much less attention has been accorded the witnesses and the Adventists. To date, there's not been a systematic examination of the full range and scope of Ellen White's place in American history. This proposal seeks to describe how a comprehensive book on Ellen White will be constructed. We seek to weave together isolated strands of existing Ellen White scholarship into book chapters enriched by additional contextual work. Conference organizers propose to link up scholars who are knowledgeable about Ellen White with specialists in her historical context. This is kind of an unusual situation because Adventist scholars have spent a lot of time talking amongst Adventists about their work, very little in the larger historical context. And there are these people who know so much about the context who know little or nothing about Ellen White. So we were putting them together to see if they could talk to each other. We didn't even know if it would work. But, of course, we didn't say that in the grant proposal. Such conversations have never taken place, which helps to explain why Ellen White has remained almost entirely within an enclosed sectarian universe. A carefully developed, intensely focused, and intentionally structured conference and book will produce more analysis and synthesis in a matter of months than has gradually accreted over several decades. Chapter authors are selected on the basis of their previous scholarly work on Ellen White. Respondents are chosen for their ability to subject chapters to additional angles of scrutiny, whether biographical or contextual. Both the formal responses to each chapter and the less formal discussions by all the participants are crucial to a thorough study. We intend this conference and this book project to model constructive discussion of a complex but important topic with sensitivity, fairness, and historical rigor. That's just a little slice of this rather complicated thing we had to present to tell the National Endowment for Humanities why they ought to invest $50,000 in this project. We were pretty pleased with our proposal. We sent it off to NEH in December 2008. And I think they were too, for the most part. I think the panel of 5 referees would have accepted our proposal, except for the fact that one referee thought that in spite of our attempts at balancing respondents and having each conference participant apply a rubric to each chapter to prevent bias, the project would be too sectarian. That was part of the quandary we faced throughout our planning. Funding sources outside the denomination thought we were too sectarian, too likely to be driven by public relations motives, and we just wanted to laugh when we thought about the General Conference asking us to do this for PR motives. That was so far from reality. And on the other hand, philanthropists in the denomination tended to suspect that our project would be iconoclastic. When our NEH grant proposal was rejected in June of 2009, we had less than 4 months to raise the second half of our $100,000 budget. The project owes a debt of gratitude to the many individuals and organizations mentioned in the book's acknowledgments. We wanted the 2009 gathering in Portland, Maine to be a working conference where we discussed previously circulated chapter drafts and responses, so we needed to limit the event to direct participants. So there were about 20 chapter authors, and there were 2 respondents for each chapter. One was a Seventh-day Adventist respondent, and one was a respondent from outside the denomination. We also added plenary speakers who were nationally known scholars and biographers, and they spoke to public audiences during this event. Joan Hedrick, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1995, and Grant Wacker, a religious historian at Duke, who's completing a biography of Billy Graham. As we put this conference together, it was a little bit like setting up a blind date. I wondered what scholars who had not been nurtured in the Adventist world, nearly half of the 67 participants, would think of her. Some of the chapter respondents had never heard of White before and had been recruited for their knowledge of larger contexts. Some were aware of her connection with the Millerites, who are known to academia almost exclusively because of the book The Disappointed, edited by Numbers and Butler, and a good number were aware of her primarily because they were familiar with Ronald Numbers' Prophetess of Health, which appeared in 1976, is now in its 3rd edition. But what would they think of her when they encountered the wide range of topics in our book? What for the respondents would constitute valid studies of Ellen White? It was really, frankly, quite scary to think about what might happen. or whether we could even talk amongst ourselves with all this collection of people in one room, when you think about it. And I actually thought it's good to have people in the room who are not Adventists or former Adventists, just so everyone else will be on their best behavior. That's how paranoid I was. But, there's a history. Some clues emerged as the conference proceeded. It was interesting to watch the respondents try to decode Adventist patois. It's hard to stop from slipping into insider language, even when you're trying not to. The respondents were appropriately unsparing when it happened. Participants were fascinated by Graham Sherrick's recontextualizing of the testimonies. They quickly grasped the significance of Ellen White's role in building healthy congregations as Sherrick reconstructed the original structure of social webs and relationship networks that underlie the testimonies. That's something you have no idea of as you read the published versions. I wonder how their response might have differed if Sherrick's chapter had begun with the published testimonies and moved forward to show their subsequent influence, as Adventist treatments have conventionally done. That, of course, is part of the story, but historians like to begin at the beginning. They asked rigorous questions. They wanted to know every facet of Ellen White's involvement in racial issues. And that's a complicated subject, as you know. They strove to understand the context of the great controversy narrative as it unfolded through various chapters. They sought to unravel Adventist and former Adventist relationship to Ellen White. Now that's a project. They wanted to know more specifically about the extent of White's influence on Adventist education and just what made it effective and distinctive. They vigorously discussed her authorial practices, including plagiarism, but without the angst of Adventist internal conversations. They were very interested in the visions, both the way they unfolded as events and the way they were received. They concluded that investigating her story was an important task, and the details were complex enough and juicy enough to invite further research, which was what we were hoping they would think. Now I want to share with you a few pictures from the conference and introduce you to some of the people who were there and who were participating. We met in the Regency Hotel in Portland, a smallish hotel built in the 19th century. It used to actually be an armory, which I thought was probably a good metaphor. And just a little bit of a look at the ambiance of downtown Portland. Much of it burned in 1866, but we were able to have a couple of meetings in a church that was standing when she lived in Portland. Sorry, I am getting a little too enthusiastic with my remote control. On the beginning of the conference, coincidentally, was October 22, not because we sought to start then, but we had to negotiate our way around the University of Wisconsin home football schedule, and we ended up with that weekend. But Joan Hedrick, the Pulitzer Prize winner, gave a presentation called Writing a Woman's Life and talked about how she went to learn how to write about a 19th century woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe. When I contacted Joan Hedrick before the conference, she had never heard of Ellen White, which was not surprising at all. So she said, I'm very excited about this occasion because I think this conference is bringing into visibility a woman who is a very important spiritual and institutional force that many people didn't know about and I didn't know about. I really applaud this effort to bring Ellen White back into visibility. And it's interesting that at the end of her talk, and there were certain people there who, when I told them a women's history scholar would be presenting, were horrified and shocked that some flaming radical feminist would, invade our conference. And to see those very same people with beaming smiles at the end of the presentation was probably all the reward I needed for the whole deal. But the questions at the end were fascinating. There were non-Adventists there, but the Adventists were the ones that asked all the questions. And if you were Adventist, you knew what underlay the questions, which might sound rather innocuous to others. But Cyril Sepulveda asked the first question, and he said, it's clear from hearing your talk that you have profound admiration for your subject, but how do you deal with the flaws? And everyone kind of sat on the edge of their chair to see what she would say. She said, I view them as great complications of the plot, as good material for biographers. And they really do. The flaws, that's what brings a person into sharp focus. Nobody's human without having flaws. To see the flaws as well as the virtues and how they intersect, we can all see in ourselves that our strengths also have a downside. Seeing the human being is seeing the human being whole. I don't see it as a problem, but I see it as a possibility. I see it as great literary material, sometimes as great didactic material. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, which did this amazing thing of bringing slavery into the mainstream of American conversation, had her own issues with with racial prejudice that a scholar like Hedrick would wish that Stowe was more enlightened, wish that she had had 20th century sensibility instead of 19th. And so she talked about how she had to deal with the fact that Hedrick wanted public transportation and facilities to be segregated. And that was something she had to deal with as she wrote. So it was a fascinating exchange. Then the following day, Friday, and the next day, Sabbath, we spent all day around this long table discussing chapters. For 45 minutes, we would discuss a chapter, which everyone had already read in advance. The author would talk for about 10 minutes, and then the respondents each had about 15 minutes. There would be time for questions. And it was a grueling schedule to pack all of this in, almost all of it in 2 days and a little bit on Sunday morning. There were 10-hour days of just doing that. And then we had meals together, and we kind of wondered, would people hang in there for the whole deal? And they actually did. It was marvelous. Ann Taves could not be there. She was the only author who couldn't. She was president of the American Academy of Religion, and so she had other duties, but she was there via Skype, and so we had a real interesting dialogue with her. Graham Sherrock talked about his chapter on the testimonies, and sorry, I keep doing this. So sensitive. And then at the meals, I kind of wondered, I thought maybe all the Adventists would go off in one place and the others in another place. But here's just this interesting collection of people on the lower right-hand picture. Ronald Graybill, Don McAdams, Joan Hedrick, Vern Carner, Ronald Lawson, and Bill Peterson. I mean, talk about interesting. I think Joan Hedrick was just learning a lot, and she thought it was all fascinating. Grant Wacker in the center was our Friday plenary speaker. To the right of center, Amanda Porterfield was the editor of Church History Journal. Grant Wacker spoke on Friday evening and talked about Billy Graham, and also Billy Graham had his own set of issues and challenges. And Wacker said, according to Martin Marty, all good history or read biography enables us to live the present in light of the past. It turns the evaluation question around. The task is not so much for us as biographers to evaluate them, but to stand back and with humility allow their lives to evaluate us. And by the way, biographers, as opposed to people who have other research agendas, just have they have a way of telling a story, and sometimes that's actually maybe a relief in a certain way. Kendra Holoviak preached sermon Sabbath morning in this historic congregational church that was a way of kind of evoking early Adventist history. And I won't go into those details now because of time, but it was a really important and spiritual moment in the midst of this busy conference. Alden Thompson and Ruth Doan were both respondents to Ted Lefterov's manuscript. This is Peggy Bendroth, the congregational librarian, speaking at one point. Floyd Greenleaf in his chapter on education, which was eventually merged with Jerry Moon's chapter on institutions because they were so closely related. And his respondents were I've just blanked out, but anyway. And the two respondents to Greenleaf's chapter, here's Alden Thompson. And this is Laura Vance, talked about Ellen White and gender, and her respondent, Bernadette McCauley. Merlin Burt from Center of Adventist Research at Andrews. And then at the end, we got everybody together for a photo. It was quite amazing that everyone was still there, still engaged, still having a really interesting time. And they told me, some of them wrote after they left, they said, we had such an interesting time with all of this, we had trouble getting our minds wrapped about our own projects. We had, of course, Grant Wacker wrote the foreword in which he talks about Ellen White and her role. He found her quite interesting. And responses to the book are just beginning to appear. It usually takes about 2 years for the book reviews to get written and published in an array of academic journals. Oxford University Press sent out early reviews of the manuscript, and so far reviews have appeared in Ministry, Spectrum, the Biblical Research Institute newsletter, the Adventist Review, and Books and Culture, which is a publication of Christianity Today. Oxford also sought reactions from academics, one of which is on the back cover of Ellen Harmon White, American Prophet. What we see there we would expect to be good news, but what I particularly appreciate of Professor Lee Eric Schmidt's comment there is his remark that as a collaborative venture, it is superbly orchestrated. It demonstrates White's profound relevance to any number of historiographies. Dialogue and conversation are what we have sought in the production of this book. We know more than to expect unanimity, but a constructive, civil conversation is a good starting point, we think. Now, the spring 2014 issue of Spectrum, many of you have likely seen that. It had a review of American Prophet by David Holland, Associate Professor of North American Religious History at Harvard University. Holland is Mormon. He notes and he's done research on Ellen White. He notes the puzzling lack of knowledge of Ellen White in the academic community. He's not sure why she's so little studied and understood, but he makes some educated guesses, which are quite interesting to read. He concludes that Ellen White would not be surprised at the neglect, as she would deem her message too otherworldly to engage secular historians. Here I have to differ with Holland, because Ellen White was very aware of the attention she got from the secular world and welcomed contact with journalists and others who sought her out to satisfy their curiosity. His speculation makes me wonder what you think. Why do you think few non-Adventists have heard of Ellen White? That's something for us to discuss later today. How do Adventists talk to each other about Ellen White? How do they talk to the larger world about her? What should characterize the conversation? We'll have time to do some more of that soon. A few weeks ago, Lavon Neff's review of American Prophet appeared in Books and Culture, published by Christianity Today. She described her own connections with Adventism when I came to Walla Walla College. Her husband was an associate pastor of the church there. She described why Ellen White was part of the reason she and her family left the church. Given that past, said Neff, I picked up American Prophet with reluctance. I'm glad I got past my initial hesitation. It turned out to be an engrossing study of an era, a church, and an indomitable woman I didn't know nearly as well as I thought I did. After reviewing the content of the book in a nuanced way that's only feasible for someone who has a significant prior knowledge of Ellen White, Neff concluded, whatever else she may have been, Ellen Harmon White was an able leader of men who deserves to be more widely known. This book is a welcome step in that direction. In record time, our work on the conference found its way into an academic book, Robert C. Fuller's The Body of Faith, a biological history of religion in America, published by University of Chicago Press in 2013. Fuller was a respondent to Ann Tave's chapter at the Portland Conference, and his manuscript was already well underway. But after the conference, he incorporated a discussion of Ellen White, albeit based on secondary sources, in one of his chapters. I fully expect we will learn a lot as scholars from outside the Adventist fold turn more scrutiny on the life and times of Ellen White. Their perspective will raise new questions, new angles of inquiry, and the possibility that someone out there might actually be paying attention to what Adventists say to each other about their collective history ought to raise the quality of our internal discourse. We have a lot to look forward to. Thank you. So, fire away.
Chuck, you've got the microphone. We'll start back here with Mike and then over to Richard. And are there hands over in this section?
If
you had the attention of the thought leaders of the Adventist Church, what would you tell them based on this conference that they don't know that they need to know?
Well, let me make maybe a little broader comment that I hope relates to that. I think that Adventists have spent a lot of time doing one of two things. On the one hand, building a wall of inerrancy and fundamentalist interpretation of Ellen White's writings around her to the point where I don't think they wanted anyone else to touch her because they might defile her. And on the other hand, people who didn't really like that approach basically tried to explain her away until there was pretty much nothing left. And I think that both of those things are not really what you want to do, and that's not what the non-SDA scholars want to do. They want to examine this complicated and rich story and look at why it is a significant piece of American religious history. So I think that this tendency to feel that if Ellen White was really exposed to the general public would somehow be a problem, I think that's just like an inverse of what you really have. I mean, and if she can't handle public scrutiny, then we do have a problem. And public scrutiny is not going to allow certain excesses to remain, right? So.
Did any of that angst inside the church kind of leak out to the non-Adventists at the conference?
Oh, yeah, well, because we had this chapter about her legacy, and although that was discussed on Sunday and people were so tired by then, I think they were,
And what was the reaction of the non-Adventist scholars to her reception in the church in the last 30 years? Was there any at all, or were they too tired?
Oh, I think they totally understood how that could be a response to what was done starting around the end of World War I and through the middle of the 20th century.
Richard?
I want to take this opportunity to thank you for the publication of Ellen Harmon White. I've been looking at it closely for about since April.
Thank you. Thank you.
An observation that came to my mind just as you were speaking, the interest in the historical Jesus, at least within the last 100 years, has captured our attention.
Sure.
The interest now within the last decade in the historical Ellen White, an interesting
parallel. And go ahead, Noel.
And a question: has there been any communication with Elaine Pagel and her historical, religious historical position in the academia?
Not that I know of, but that's an excellent suggestion, and if it hasn't happened already, it should. We'll make sure it does. I know Martin Marty saw the book and he has a lot of former students as authors, so he was pretty happy. But about the historical Jesus, the historical Ellen White, certainly, and this is one thing I would say to denominational leaders, it's very understandable that there would be a reluctance to take her out into this larger arena, because by looking at the historical Ellen White, you both enlarge her and diminish her. She's no longer unique and special and enclosed in this special universe. She has context, she actually does have, there's a context of shouting Methodism and visionary experiences, which Ann Taves has already documented, and other things that help to explain that she spoke a semiotic language that was familiar to the people around her. That's one reason that she did get an audience. And so it enlarges her by making other people know about their significant historical role. It diminishes her by, in some ways, making her seem less special, less isolated. So that's understandable.
Somewhat risky to be human.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
We've got a question over here. I think when people in the audience may not be familiar, when you speak of church history, that is the magazine for church history, the journal for church history.
Yes, the journal for church history and religious history.
And you speak of the American Academy of Religion. That is the national organization.
Yes.
And you speak of people like Grant Wacker, and some of these are nationally known.
Grant Wacker was president of that organization, as was Ronald Numbers.
Yeah, so it's really impressive that you got that crowd there. This
And you
wasn't
know
just-
what? They
yeah.
were excited. They thought this was a great
Cool.
story. They were pumped up. And here, I know I was so terrified of what could happen. I was afraid some nut job would break into our conference and do disruptive things. And on Friday, I thought I knew everybody. I mean, I commissioned Vern Carner to be the bouncer, and I was just, freaked out. And this young man with short hair and very earnest looking, kind of conservatively dressed, was pounding away on his computer, and I didn't know who he was. I said, that's the one. That's the nut that's come in to mess us up. As it turned out, it was one of our respondents I hadn't met yet. And he was Nazarene, and so he kind of knew what the landscape was like. And he did a wonderful blog entry that same night on the conference. So
Pays to know who
I
you
tried
know.
to
Yeah.
get over my paranoia.
The gentleman here, and then we're over to Mary Proctor Dane. Chuck, back on this side in a minute.
Yeah, I was introduced to your book because my son Jim was one of your students.
Oh, yeah. It's good to meet
And
you.
I'm an Adventist pastor up in Oregon Conference, and I was very interested. Have you seen your book go out to the lay Adventist yet? Because after reading the book, I'm surprised there isn't more reaction to it.
Well, Michael Campbell reviewed the book in the Adventist Review a few weeks ago, reasonably negatively. He participated in the conference. He did not write a chapter. Eric Anderson, one of our chapter authors, wrote a response to Michael Campbell, which I hope the review will publish. Michael was concerned that the book did not create faith in Ellen White and so forth. And of course, the book is not for an Adventist audience. And when we had it, I presented it at the Walla Walla University Alumni Weekend. And we sold books on campus, and then they had a book sale at the Adventist Book Center. And people came, I wasn't sure how they were going to handle this book, and I kept saying, now remember, this is for a oh yeah, we understand, and so far. But I also had, someone told me that an Adventist religion professor, had told them the book made him livid. So there's going to be that too. And I guess that's what happens. That's the big risk you take. When you put Ellen White out in public, you will have people come to conclusions that are startling and may be different from what Adventists might conclude. But as you know, within Adventism, there's such a plethora of ways that she might be interpreted. And so that's just the price you pay for stepping into the current of history, I guess. Oh, another thing, someone asked what I would discuss with church leaders, I would say the best way to respond to this book would be to be officially neutral. We don't seek an endorsement of it, but also we seek the understanding that as more questions are asked and more investigations done by various people, that there will be new angles that we are perhaps startled by. But I also think that the overall effect will be a healthy effect. You know what's happened within Adventism as people have dug up this or that thing and it's gone and started all kinds of stuff. I think this will be perhaps a corrective to some of those internal discussions.
It's Oxford University Press, after all, Dr. Mary Proctor Dane back here in the red. And then we'll go over to Les Palinka, Chuck, and over to Jim, and I think we'll be about out of time.
Okay. Am I on?
Oh,
There we go. Yeah, just get it closer
I think
to your
it's
mouth.
I think it's
Am I
on.
on now?
Yeah.
Okay. 1875 was sort of a remarkable year in American history. I think that Smith College for Women was founded in that year. I think that Oberlin was founded in that year, and it was the first college that admitted women of co-ed colleges. And I wondered if you could speak to that atmosphere and what Ellen White's relationship to that wave of feminism. Did she have any knowledge of it? Do you think that she rode in on it in some way?
The larger world of women's activities was primarily, Ellen White connected it primarily through the temperance movement. And some suffragists and temperance people were the same, and some had specific orientations. Ellen White was never a feminist. Laura Vance notes that very carefully. It would distort her to call her some kind of proto-feminist. However, she has very strong interests in women participating in the life of the church in ways that were perhaps startling to some who were more traditional. And of course, she promoted the reform dress, which was really a feminist thing, but she didn't really identify with feminism in that particular instance directly, because she modified the bloomer outfit, which was more radically feminist than what she wore, which was just a shorter skirt. But you know, she was innovative, and she was certainly she was supportive of Frances Willard's work in the WCTU, and had some connection with that, and I think she rode that wave of temperance work by women, and that's why she was such a popular speaker in the 1870s. That's when she really takes off with a public speaking career, as opposed to speaking in Adventist churches as she did in the 1860s. Even then it was very unusual for women to speak to an audience of men and women.
Now we're back to Les Palinka.
My question is much like the prior one here. I haven't read the book, but my curiosity is, did your group, or has there been some study done about Ellen White's awareness about current affairs, about the world around her, for example, or the intricacies of the Civil War that was raging during her time? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, Eric Anderson talks a good deal about that in his chapter on Civil War and race. And the Adventists, of course, were on the radical fringe of abolitionism, something that no established denomination would adopt. Adventists, when before they formed in 1863, in the early years of the Civil War, they were just becoming a denomination, spoke out vigorously for the immediate abolition of slavery, which made them extremely radical. Most abolitionists were not even religious. They were so upset with the way the churches were failing to deal with this problem. There were anti-slavery people like Harriet Beecher Stowe in the churches, but not abolitionists. So Smith and the Whites were powerful in that particular message. Ellen White becomes more conventional later in her life as she tries to figure out how to deal with Jim Crow segregation in the South, but still that whole story of her work with the South, that comes both from Eric Anderson and also from Douglas Morgan's chapter. And her interest in religious liberty, very much aware of things going on around her. When she is in 1909, she goes in her final speaking tour, she's pretty sure the world is really just about to end because of the storm clouds that are producing World War I, about to produce it. She's very aware of that as well. So I would say she's tied into the kind of the spirit of the times.
Doc, can you stand, please, so people can see who's talking, and go fire away. Thanks.
I'd just like to respond to the pastor from Oregon. My opinion is that if we can allow critical analysis, it might keep people in the church instead of worrying about bringing people into the church.
Well, and you will see those kinds of reactions. So some would feel that the book could threaten their faith in Ellen White, and others would see and have told me that it has made them feel more confident in her and want to read her writings again. So I expect we will continue to see that.
Yeah, I know you don't feel like standing. Mary, go ahead and just speak, please. Yeah.
How large of a part took place in Ellen G. White's health messages and her practical admonishments and tips on having a healthy and safe environment to raise children, having a happy home, having good hygiene, and all that. I'm so interested in that aspect of her life and what she did. Was there a lot of lectures given by her? And was there
Oh, yes.
how great was the interest? And is there a book that, it focuses on that
There's a
part of
book
her
that
life?
needs to be written about that.
Yeah.
Just Laura Vance touches on it briefly, but we feel that this book is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. And there's so many more topics, especially I expect that we'll be panned by women's studies scholars for not having enough emphasis on those areas.
Yeah, I love the book Back to Eden. I don't know how many of you, my dad, always used that book and books like that. And I would really welcome a book like that.
I think that will happen. I think that will happen.
Chuck, we've got time for one more question here. Dwayne Dutcher across the aisle from you.
I'm just curious. It appears that our General Conference is very conservative at this point. Do you think this is going to stimulate any type of discussion that will perhaps encourage a little more liberal thought in our denomination?
Well, my department at Walla Walla College back around 1900 was called the Department of History and Prophecy. But I don't know if I want to accept that mantle right now to predict what might happen. But I think, she's going to be out there, people are going to be talking about her, and we'll just see how that goes. I think, as John Pauline said in his review of the book for ministry, and there were places in the book that made him uncomfortable, but he participated in the conference, was very positive about all of what was going on. He said, he quoted Ellen White at the end, and she said, "Remember, truth can afford to be fair."
Do we have time for one more? Okay, quick. Come on back over and sure. Thank you, sir.
Did Ellen White ever suggest or deny women's ordination?
I knew we should have quit while we were ahead. No.
Well, if she had said it a little more specifically, we would maybe not be having some of the long conversations we did. She and James were both supportive of women in ministry, and when the issue came up in the fall of 1881, James had just died, and this was at the General Conference. Ellen did not attend. For about a year, she was so devastated by her husband's death, she didn't do much in public activity. If they had been there, I just wonder how that might have turned out. I will say, well, we have a question to discuss this afternoon about the whole headship issue. We'll just wait and do it then when we have time to give more attention to it.
Way to keep the crowd coming. Yes, thank you very much. We appreciate it. If you are here for the first time, let me remind you again that after the worship service, there's a fellowship meal. This room gets transformed with tables and food and everything while you're worshiping. And so we have a lot of other guests here for a Pathfinder program during worship. We knew you were coming, and we've got food for you. And the larger audience comes and sits in here and chats about the Chargers and how much they're going to lose by tomorrow and that sort of thing. Those who want to continue the discussion with Dr. Aamodt are invited to go from here over to our boardroom, and we'll show you where that is once you get your food. There's napkins and tableware and drink and that kind of stuff over there, so all you have to do is kind of take a plate full of food and balance it and go on over. And we'll sit there till 2 or 2:30, and you can continue this conversation with her if you'd like. We're so glad that you're here this morning. Please join us for our next meeting. Don't forget, you can go online, you can still register for the national seminar here in 3 weeks in San Diego. And I think that's it.